This program is made possible by Atlantic Richfield Company. Energy, chemicals, minerals.
The story is told by Glaucon in the second book of Plato's Republic, where Glaucon and his brother Adeimantus are trying to get Socrates to explain to them why being just to others is an aid to leading a happy life. And they tell him the story of Gyges. Gyges was a servant in the household of the king of Lydia. And Gyges fell in love with the queen, and the queen with him. And the queen gave Gyges a ring, which if he turned around made him invisible. Gyges used the ring, made himself invisible, killed the king and married the queen, and became the ruler of Lydia. The point of the story is, what would you do if you could buy the ring? If there was only one ring of Gyges in the world, would you buy it? Suppose, for example, as you walked past Tiffany's on Fifth Avenue, you saw a little sign, little ring in a black case, and said, "Ring of Gyges, moderately priced, inquire within." Would you go in and ask about the price? If you could buy it, would you buy it? And if you bought it, how would you use it? Remembering one thing, that the ring of Gyges would enable you to do anything you wanted to the community, to other individuals, and get away with it completely. You could do anything you wanted and have no fear of being caught or punished. Would you still be just?
Mortimer Adler, the idea is justice. Nobody can do much thinking, if any at all, says philosopher Mortimer Adler, without using the great ideas that constitute the basic vocabulary of human thought. Of all the ideas that have shaped the West, he identifies a few as truly pivotal, among them truth, goodness and beauty, liberty, equality, and justice. Mortimer Adler has spent a lifetime in the intellectual company of philosophers, seeking to help the rest of us understand how one great idea touches another and how they affect our daily lives. No idea stands alone, sealed off from the others, but to justice he accords sovereignty as the one unlimited good. We can want more liberty and equality than is good for us to have, he says. Not so with justice. To do good is to act justly, and no society can be too just.
Justice consists in securing and respecting natural rights. And injustice is the violation or transgression of those rights. Thus, for example, to enslave a man, violating the right of his right to liberty, his natural right to liberty, is an act of injustice. To kill a man who has a right to his life is an act of injustice. That's one mode of injustice, or one aspect of injustice is the violation of natural rights. The second aspect of justice is fairness. When you pay more for what you get than you should pay, when you get less than what you pay for, that's an unfair transaction. When women and men work at the same task, and the women, because they're women, get paid less than the men, that's unfair discrimination. The third aspect of justice is in terms of the common good of the community. If a person bribes a judge, he is, in some sense, corrupting due process of law upon which the welfare of the community depends, and that is against the common good.
How am I committing an injustice against someone when I wrong them?
Well, because the essential meaning of injustice is injury. Words are very close together. Really? There is no injustice that doesn't injure somebody. And an unjust act either injures another individual or injures the common community.
So if I do in any way injure a community or a person, that's unjust.
That's right.
What's the condition for knowing what is right and wrong in the conduct of one individual toward another?
Well, I've said before, and I'm going to say it again. When you know what is really good for you, the things that are really good for you for your life, you know what is right for me to have. I should have the real goods too. If you deprive me of those real goods, you're injuring me. If you don't help me obtain those real goods, you're injuring me. You have to know what the real goods are first.
If freedom is right for me, then
right for me too. And when you deprive me of it by enslaving me, you're wronging me.
If knowledge is good for me,
if knowledge is good for you, then you know that this knowledge is good for all the children of this land. And if you're in a community where the question is whether you'll pay higher taxes to support a good school system, and don't do it. You're acting against the common good that indirectly affects those children.
And that's unjust.
You're right.
What is the relationship between justice and happiness?
That's a hard question. It's a question that Plato pondered, that Aristotle pondered. Justice is, I have to say two things. In the traditional language of the discussion of this matter, the three cardinal moral virtues are courage, temperance, and justice. And justice is the virtue that regards the other. I'm never just with respect to myself, I'm just with respect to you. I'm temperate with respect to myself, and I'm courageous. I could be courageous on a desert island with no other around. I could be temperate on a desert island, but I can't be just if there are no other human beings around, correct? Now, if those are three separate virtues, I could be temperate and courageous without being just. But if they're three aspects of an integral virtue, then I can't be temperate and courageous without being just. They're not three separate virtues, but three ways of looking at virtue. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, virtue is the will's direction to the right end, a good human life.
Choosing those things
That's right.
which bring about a good human
Now
life.
then, a man, if these three aspects of virtue are integrated, a man can't be courageous and temperate without being just. He can't be, on the one hand, aiming at the right end and being temperate, and then aiming at the wrong end by being unjust. So that I think the real reason why you should be just is because you need moral virtue as an indispensable condition of your pursuit of happiness. And you can't have moral virtue in part. One of the most extraordinary things that Aristotle said toward the end of the sixth book of his Ethics is that a man can't be prudent without being morally good. He can't be morally good without being prudent. He can't be temperate without being courageous and just, or just without being temperate and courageous. In other words, you can't have, most people think, I've got some virtues and some vices. You've got some vices, you haven't got any virtue.
Oh?
That's right. If your character manifests any vice at all, you aren't virtuous. Aristotle is insisting virtue is an integral whole. It's a very strict doctrine.
So is there a just man walking the earth?
Is there a virtuous man?
The ideal way to teach the great ideas, says Mortimer Adler, who's been doing it for 60 of his 80 years, is not by telling, but by asking. Asking questions is what he does in seminars every summer at the Aspen Institute in Colorado. The people who come here share his enthusiasm for knowledge that increases long after schooling has ended. The inspiration behind the Institute is simply that it's never too late to think afresh, if you will submit your opinions about great ideas to the scrutiny of others. Mortimer Adler is rankled by the suggestion that all this has nothing to do with the real world. He agrees with Plato that ideas are real as objects of thought. Says Adler, the idea of justice does not cease to exist just because you cease to think about it. Philosophy then helps us to think about experienced reality, about nature, human behavior, and social institutions. The fact that not even his heroes were sometimes stumped for answers takes nothing away from the importance of the questions.
Again, at the beginning of our Western tradition, Plato starts it off by posing two questions so difficult that he himself did not quite succeed in answering them. One is the question of why should I be just to anybody else if I'm pursuing my own happiness? Other virtues, temperance and courage, are perfectly obvious means to my well-being and happiness, but justice is concerned with the other. I'm just to you and I don't injure you. Why should I refrain from injuring you if I want to be happy myself? In the second book of the Republic, Glaucon and Adeimantus push Socrates very, very hard on this. They say, suppose a man in the community had a reputation for justice, but actually was very unjust, injuring others and profitably gaining from his injustice to others, as opposed to another man who really was just, but had the reputation for injustice, was punished for it. Wouldn't the first man be better off than the second? As that debate between Glaucon and Adeimantus, by the way, are the nephews of Plato in this dialogue, and they keep pushing Socrates, one of them remembers a story told by Herodotus. It's the story of Gyges. Gyges was a servant in the household of the king of Lydia, fell in love with the queen fell in love with Gyges. The queen gave Gyges a ring, which if turned around made Gyges invisible. Using the ring, Gyges killed the king and married the queen. It's Story clear? You're walking up Fifth Avenue on a bright, sunny morning, and you pass Tiffany's at 57th Street. And in one of those little windows with a black case, there's a nice gold ring, and it says under it, Ring of Gyges. Moderately priced, inquire within. Now, there are 3 questions I want all of you to answer. All 3 questions. 1, would you go and inquire? Would you inquire about the price of the ring? 2, if it was within your power to buy it, reasonably priced, would you buy it? 3, if you bought it, how would you use it? Yes, Jeremy?
Well, as a New Yorker, I would know a scam when I saw one.
Now would you answer the question?
Which?
Would you buy the ring?
No, I mean, I said, as a New
No,
Yorker.
I want you to apply your principles. Why wouldn't you buy the ring?
Well, because it's a power I wouldn't want to have.
Why not? Why not? Well, let me be clear. If you have the ring, you certainly can be as unjust as you wish to anybody else and get away with it. That's perfectly clear, isn't it, Jeremy? That's what the ring is intended for. That's what Gyges used it for. He killed the king, married the queen. Why wouldn't you want the ring in order to be unjust and gain from your injustice and get away with it? Now tell me why you wouldn't. Why would that destroy your happiness? Please answer the question.
Well, because in a certain sense, I agree with the naturalist position. That there is an intrinsic feeling, an ultimate intrinsic feeling of injustice. Now, I ask myself, what is an example of a natural injustice? I've been trying, as this discussion has proceeded, to figure out what would be a universally agreed upon specific example.
Killing someone, perhaps.
I think that's right. And now I ask myself, why is that an example? I mean, why would...
Everyone has a right to life.
Well, but those are just words.
Oh, they're not words. No,
Yes, they are. I mean, what is the instinct? We're talking about a natural justice, which is some sort of instinctual thing. What is the instinct which makes us recoil both against murder and against capital punishment? What is that instinct? And I think the instinct is a fear of our own death.
Have you answered my question?
I've tried.
Ruth, you try.
I would inquire about the ring, and if I could use it in ways that I wanted to use it, I would buy it.
Tell me how you'd use it.
I would use it to get rid of all of the unjust laws, unless that were unjust by my definition.
You need to be invisible to do that?
No, but it might help sometimes.
How about you, Bob? Come on.
I love the idea of Ruth's point that you would use it only for good and to benefit. And of course, that was a rather subjective view, and I'm not sure anyone here, even our moderator, has the total wisdom to be able to make that.
I refuse to answer the question. but what you have forgotten, and what I think Ruth has forgotten, is, again, why Glaucon and Adeimantus asked this question. They say they're trying to get Socrates to show them that being just to others, treating them justly, not injuring them, actually serves you in your pursuit of your own happiness. Now they say, let's see if that's true or not, by taking a case in which you could be unjust to others and not get caught and have illicit gains from injustice to others. Why isn't that more expedient in the pursuit of happiness than being just? Why should you be just to others? If you can get away, see, if you say, well, if I'm unjust, I'll get caught and punished. The ring saves you from that. How about it now?
Well, I think in light of that, if I'm going to get away with it, no.
You are. Yes, you are. The ring, turn it around. You get. By the way,
No,
Getting away with
what I really say is that I think it proves a point that perhaps many of us believe here, is that man is innately good, and innately does not wish to harm others.
I agree
Robin,
with that.
Robin.
I would certainly inquire, and I would want to acquire it. But because I am sufficiently skeptical, even though I think I might want to use it wisely, I would worry so much that I would want to dispose of it, so that it could never be used.
What would you worry about?
I would worry about it being used in the wrong way.
By you.
By anyone who might also fall, it might also fall into someone else's hands.
But
Even by me, yes.
You've bought it now.
Surely, I've bought it, and I might be, you know, as Ruth said, there are certain things I'd like to change. You're invisible, it might make it a lot easier to change them. But I still don't feel that that is, that I would use that kind of a device if I had it.
John?
Well, all right. Your question seems to imply that it would only be used for injustice.
No other purpose to it, it seems to me.
Oh, no, I disagree with that. I think it can quite demonstrate that you could do good works with it, as Ruth suggests. If some people are plotting a murder or treason against the state, and you are in a position to make yourself invisible and find out about it, you can avert a serious injustice. So I think you can use it for good. I wouldn't want to have it for that reason, for the same reasons expressed around the table. The risk that each of us has within ourselves that we would not be sure which was just and unjust, and we would misuse it. But let me come to the point I think you want to get at, which is whether we would have it to use unjustly, and if not, why not?
Yeah.
And I would not have it to use it unjustly.
Because?
Get away with it, as you put it, because I think acting unjustly, even when you get away with it, is so internally corrosive. It does injury to yourself. There is an aspect about the human person which suffers whether anyone knows about it when he acts unjustly.
Betty Sue?
If John is right, and I agree with him, which isn't to say he's right, but I agree with him, then doesn't it follow that the pursuit of our own happiness is not our primary obligation?
I don't think it follows at all, but the pursuit of happiness is not our primary obligation. Socrates is asking, this question that is being asked of Socrates by Glaucon and Adeimantus is this. Our primary obligation is to pursue happiness. And tell me how justice fits into that pursuit. That's the way the question is put.
Easy.
What?
I find it easy because the sense of having behaved justly is an extremely important part of human happiness.
I'll come back to you. Yes?
My instinct was to have nothing to do with it.
The ring.
Yeah, I have nothing to do with the ring. I wouldn't get it, I wouldn't investigate, I wouldn't want to know the price, I wouldn't buy it, I wouldn't have anything to do with it. Then why? Well, very much along the lines of what John said. I would, however, hope that it gets into the hands of someone who would use it for good. Because it would be bothersome if I felt sure that it would get into the hands of someone who would use it for evil, maybe against me. But even then, I would prefer not to have something to do with it, but hope that it would get into the hands of someone who would use it for good. Now, I ought to get to the next point, and that is, it seems to me that much of our discussions about justice have to do with a rather constraining concept of the human being. You should not do that which will harm. You should not do that which will cause inequality. There's not much talk about a positive view of the human being that you ought to do that which will enhance goodness, not only for yourself, but for others, because of that positive side of the human being. And if we therefore can see certain positives in human beings, that they do exist in fact, and ought to be pursued, then through our system of education, through our legislative process, through our political process, through whatever process we want to pursue these ideas with, I think we have a better capacity to dream and put in more efforts, because our efforts are to some extent commensurate with our vision and dreams.
I only want to say, Francis, in terms of what you've just said, that justice is not negative, it's positive as well as negative. You're completely right about that. As Aquinas states the first two precepts of the natural moral law, the first is seek the good, avoid evil for yourself. And the second one is do good to others and do not injure them. Notice the order of that. Seek the good and avoid evil. Do good to others and avoid injuring them.
I have, Mortimer, a hit list. And I would get rid of them first.
No injustice in that at all.
None at all. They are evil people who have not yet learned the nature of what is universal correctness and righteousness and so on and so forth, and I can't convince them, so I'm just going to get rid of them. Not many, it's a small list, but it's decisive. Having done that, I would then take the ring and go out onto the middle of the ocean, and for the reasons stated, I just don't trust power in anybody's hands, including my own, after I complete my hits. I would dump it in the middle of the ocean. I would note where I dumped it. I would go back home and I would take lessons in deep sea diving.
Were you surprised when none of them thought they could use the ring justly? See, as they went around the room, they all said, I don't want to use the ring because I'm afraid I would use it unjustly.
They were all, I think, quite properly concerned with the strength of their moral character. Having the ring would be a temptation. If you asked me how I would answer the question myself, I think I'd go in and inquire. I wouldn't have the sense to do what one man once told me. He said he'd go in and inquire, ask the price of the ring, and then said, may I try it on? And then take trying it on, turn it around, and walk out with it, committing the first act of injustice.
But what struck me as they talked about it was that they recognized that it's risky to have such a possession, not only because one might be unjust with it, but because it might require a commitment to justice. And committing yourself to promoting justice is risky.
It's very strenuous and very arduous. The reasoning is very simple. If I need moral virtue, that's not enough. I need the goods of fortune as well. But if I need moral virtue to make the right choices, and making the right choices I need in order to lead a good life and reach the end of having created a good life for myself, having lived well on earth, then doing injustice to others, which means the loss of my moral virtue, frustrates, destroys my pursuit of happiness. Now, then you say, well, why not buy the ring? You would never use it if you really know what you're doing, if you are seeking to make a good life, and you know that being just is part of that search. The trouble is we're all weak. I want to come back to something that John said, because it pushes the argument further. He said, I would not, even if I could get away with it, and have illicit gains as a result of getting away with it because the ring made me invisible and I wouldn't be caught in my depredations upon others in society, I would not do so. I would not be unjust to others for intrinsic reasons, because being unjust is corrosive. Yep. Now, it's that word I want to examine. I'll come to you first, John. How does being, I really have, it's a simple question, but all I can say is Plato didn't answer it. Socrates didn't answer it, maybe you can. How does being unjust to others corrode your soul? How does being unjust to others, and don't tell me your conscience will hurt. I don't want any reference to conscience. Tell me how it corrodes your person, corrodes your soul.
Well, of course, their inability doesn't encourage me to try.
Anyone else?
I don't know why you want to put the idea of conscience to rest so quickly, unless you mean it is only a narrow psychological phenomenon and nothing more.
Because it's a word that doesn't help us understand the problem. Look, let me put it this way.
Well, maybe words aren't equal to the task.
I'll tell you why. Suppose I admit that your conscience is your intuitive and innate sense of right and wrong. And you say, if I used the ring to do an unjust act, my conscience would know it was wrong, and then taking Alan's point, and I would have remorse. I'd have a deep remorse. I'd have the anguish of remorse. Is that what you're talking about? Is the corroding of your soul the anguish of remorse for having done something you know is wrong? Is that it? Is that the corrosive part of it?
Well, I'm sure that's part of it. I'm not sure that's all of it, because the idea of remorse, as you just described it, sounded to me like a more temporary thing. You'd get over it, if not tomorrow, then surely by the middle of next week. Mm-hmm. And the corrosive aspect I have in mind is more permanent than that. The remorse would be felt most deeply in the short run, but you would have changed yourself fundamentally. You would be less of a person. Your personal dignity would be diminished for the rest of your life. Even if your conscience didn't bother you 10 years from that episode, even if you didn't have it cognitively in mind, you would be less of a person.
I like that answer better, that you would have changed yourself in a way that you don't want to see yourself changed. Marco?
Yes, I would have a different answer to that, obviously. But I think it applies to the West and to people who are not part of the West. I think the reason that you would be changed in a negative way or feel negative in some way is because you have been imprinted with a set of cultural values which become an implicit part of your psyche. And to violate them is to break your harmony with the group, to break your harmony with the culture, and you feel alone. And that is a disposition, one of the ultimate horrors, I think, of human beings. And I think that ultimately is the basis of human morality, is that we destroy our connection with the group, and we believe that the group is manifested in us through the imprint of various values, and I think the most important are our moral convictions.
Why should I be just to anyone else?
It would appear that when I'm just to somebody else, it's to their good, not my good. When I injure them, they're injured. I'm not injured. Why should I be just? I think an indication to the answer, though it was not fully explicated, is what Judge Newman said in our discussion. Namely that when I'm injuring somebody else, it's corrosive. It corrodes my own character. It has a corrosive influence on me. Now, of course, if I'm unjust just once, or even twice, that is not the case. But suppose I'm steadily, habitually inclined to injure others, as many men are, then my character is really corroded, and I suffer. Now, why do I suffer?
Yeah, that's the question.
And I'll tell you, the only answer I know to that question is, that I cannot be unjust to others and also temperate and courageous myself. These three virtues, these three basic virtues, are not really separate, distinct virtues that I can have one without the other. They're three aspects of an integral virtue, which is a habit of acting for the right end in life. My whole life is a good life, and choosing the right means. Now, if I'm directed to the right end by my habitual virtuous inclination, I can't partly go to the wrong end and partly to the right end. If I'm tempered by avoiding yielding to the seductions of too much pleasure, if I'm courageous because I have the right end in view, if I'm courageous by willingly taking on pains and hardships because I want to lead a good life, I can't turn around and then say, well, that's not my end, I can be unjust. In other words, what I'm saying, though it's hard to understand, and Aristotle only says it in one small chapter toward the end of his Ethics, is a man cannot be just without being temperate and courageous. He can't be temperate without being courageous and just. He can't be courageous without being temperate and just. If that's the case, and one more step, if I need moral virtue as an habitual inclination toward the end of my good life, then I lose it by being unjust. That's the corrosive effect. By being unjust to others, I'm weaned away from temperance and courage in my own actions. And therefore, I'm not pursuing happiness effectively.
If I'm going to act rightly towards you, if I'm going to be just towards you, I'm going to have to exercise occasionally courage to do what is beyond my own self-interest.
Precisely.
And I'm going to have to moderate my own appetites
for pleasures.
For pleasure, so that I do not do at your expense something that is satisfying to me.
Precisely. You couldn't have said it better.
Well, I'm glad I finally said something in this seminar.
The remarkable thing is that Plato asked at the beginning of our tradition the two hardest questions about justice. One you've just tried to answer, and the next is harder still. It occurs here and there in the defense of Socrates in his trial, but in the dialogue called the Gorgias, it is the center of the discussion. I'll put the question to you very carefully, and then ask you to think of your answer, and I'd like to hear your answer. The question Socrates raises is, which should I prefer? If I'm forced to make a choice, I understand you can't get out of this, you're compelled to make a choice. If I have to make the choice between doing injustice to somebody else or failing to do that, suffering injustice because I fail to do it, doing injustice to somebody else or failing to do it, suffer injustice, which should I prefer? This is not an academic question. It's happened in many of our societies today, particularly in the Nazi or totalitarian or fascist regimes. Which would you prefer? Now, let me put it to you personally now, not just generally. If you were faced with the alternatives of either doing injustice to somebody else, and a serious one, a very serious one, or failing to do it, suffering a serious injustice to yourself, such as death or life imprisonment or torture.
Underscore your question of Germany, because that ultimately became the individual question of everyone in the society.
Yes.
Do they go along hoping they can do justice later, by being alive and being in the society, and some justified great injustice on the rationalization that, well, they could do something about changing the situation. So I think ultimately human beings have to be willing to suffer that injustice, even up to death, or there's no civilization ultimately.
Can you give me a concrete example of a situation where men are given the choice between rendering injustice to someone else or being treated unjustly themselves?
Just imagine the case of a morally sensitive and morally virtuous German who is impressed into the services of the Nazis and becomes a god in a Nazi concentration camp and is ordered to take part in the torture of Jews in that camp. If he fails, he will be severely punished by his Nazi commander. What does he do? Does he resist because he's a morally virtuous man torturing the Jews according to the order of the camp's commander? Or does he, and then suffer maltreatment at the hands of the Nazis, or does he engage in the torture? That's the kind of choice that many men have had to make.
One of the things that we learned from Martin Luther King is if there isn't something for which you're willing to die for, you don't have a purpose for living. And I would suffer the injustice because I would feel I could cope with it somehow, and it would perhaps give me, if it was not death, a greater opportunity to do justice in the future, as opposed to imposing justice on someone, which diminishes the human personality. There is no way to impose injustice on another individual or group without diminishing yourself.
Let me tell you, Plato, this second question, Plato does answer. And I have to give you the terms of his answer. He says, I would always advocate suffering the injustice rather than doing it. Because any injustice I can suffer hurts me externally, hurts my body, hurts my external situation. No injustice that I can suffer touches my soul. But if I do injustice, I do my soul in, not my body. I suffer injustice externally, I do injustice internally. Yes?
I can deal with an injustice. I don't think you can live without dealing with an injustice. I cannot deal with doing an injustice. I think that it is possible for me to learn through an injustice and also to ritualize it, to gain access to those who commit those injustices, whereas I feel in committing an injustice, I actually diminish myself simply, as I said, because I am alone then.
Coco, what do you think of Plato's answer before you tell me?
I want to say something about Plato's question.
Yeah.
I think it is an anachronistic question. It is a question the relevance of which has been overtaken by history. No nation now can afford to ask this question because if each of our nations and each individual deals from his own personal self-righteousness, he is already wrong because it diminishes the overall capacity of humankind to survive in a civilized fashion. With the means of destruction that are now available not only to governments, but to individuals. Yeah. This question has ceased to be relevant, and it distorts the basic dilemma that we face.
A point of view has been advanced that, we never inflict an injustice on the other, even if we know that if we don't do it, an injustice will be inflicted upon us. That means that you cannot engage in any warfare, because warfare by definition is unjust. I am given a gun, and I'm asked to go out and kill somebody whom I never saw before. He never did anything at all to me. There's no personal relationship whatsoever. Nevertheless, I go out and kill him. And we have been doing that for I do not know how long, and we say there are just wars and there are unjust wars. Now, why am I performing this act of injustice? Because I know if I don't perform that act of injustice, I will have to live, I don't know for how long, with the injustice he will pose upon me, my family, my children, my people, and forever. Now, the same thing is true if you're going to commit a revolutionary act, and at some point the thing becomes violent. But unless we take a totally pacifist position, unless we really are Gandhi, or unless we are ready to assume the role of Jesus Christ and say that I am prepared to suffer every possible injustice, because if I strike back, or if I strike in advance, because sometimes striking back is too late, if I strike back, I am ruining my soul, then I think unless we take that position, if we are going to take a pragmatic position, I think in the final analysis, no matter what we say, comes the reality, we will stand up and strike out, and not wait necessarily until we're struck, in anticipation of being struck, because we know we have to be struck.
If really confronted with this choice, I would then be forced to make up my own mind, ultimately, about my views of religion. And so how I answer it today would be sort of a transitory temporal thing. I'd like to say, as everyone here has, I would suffer the injustice. I'm not so sure. And I think if the choice were put to me in a context where I had at least a few moments to think about it, if it was instantaneous, I have no idea how I'd react. But you I assume, are putting the question under circumstances where reflective thought was possible. At that point, I think I would have to ultimately make up my mind about the issues you've put to one side, how I felt about the hereafter.
I must say to you, because what you say provokes this remark, that in the dialogue of the Gorges, it ends with the notion that if I do injustice to others, the stain on my soul will be seen by the judges of my life in the hereafter. I mean, Plato doesn't answer the question, as you indicated, without the myth of the hereafter, or the notion of the hereafter, in which his soul stands before the judges of good and evil.
You write in Sixth Grade Ideas, quote, "One cannot do good and avoid injuring or doing evil to others without knowing what is really good for them."
That, I think, is a fundamental truth. That is why I think that a controversy that has existed among philosophers, whether the idea of the good or of the right is primary, can be solved. I think the good takes precedence over the right. Unless I know what is really good for me and what I should have for a decent human life, I cannot know what is right for you. When I do know what is really good for me, I know it's really good for you too, and you have a right to it. And therefore my knowledge of the good, what is really good for a human being to have, in accordance with his needs, tells me what your rights are. In fact, I wrote a book some years ago which said, natural needs make natural rights. Let me state for you this fundamental issue about the relation of justice to law in order to ask you where you stand, which side of the issue you take. On the one side is the position of the naturalist. You can use that word as the key word. The naturalist who holds that we can know what is just and unjust prior to the enactment of the positive laws of the state or the customs of the community. We can know what is a violation of natural rights. We can know what is unfair. We can know what is contrary to the common good. On the other side of this issue is the position of the positivist or legalist. And positivist is probably the key word for this. The positivist who holds that prior to the enactment of man-made laws or positive laws by the state or the establishment of customs, prior to this, there is nothing just or unjust. On this view, what is just or unjust varies from community to community and from time to time according to the laws or customs that are established and enforced in a particular community at a particular time. I'd like to really have this just hold it this whole period before we break, concentrate on this issue. Which position, the naturalist or the positivist position, do you take? May I ask the two justices or judges here to address themselves first to this question? Which side do you take, John?
Many decisions by courts have been done in the name of natural law, both within our system and within other systems. I do not subscribe to that. I do not subscribe to judges, at least as a general way of performing their function, to presume to know and interpret and apply the natural law. There may be some issues that arise in the course of a legal system where the positive law is so vague, indeed perhaps even to the point of being non-existent, and the case is before the judge and it must be decided one way or the other. Judges don't often have the luxury of some philosophy seminarians. They must decide. So There are occasions when they must have recourse to something if the positive law doesn't give them any guidance at all. But for most of the matters that come to courts, as we think of courts in our constitutional system and in most of the court systems of the world, there is sufficient positive law. And when a judge says, well, there's the positive law, but I choose to adhere to something beyond it, namely the natural law, I think the judge is behaving unjustly. If I just complete the thought, if the philosophers, and by that I don't mean only the professional philosophers, I mean anybody who chooses to take the time to think about these ideas, if the philosophers in that sense can evolve a system for themselves and for their society of what the natural law ought to be, I think that's fine, and I think that's a process that goes on all the time. So I distinguish between our thinking about the natural law as free people with free minds and with the power of rational thought. I think natural law has a place in that realm. I'm very cautious of its role in the realm of the administration of justice.
Would you say, I appreciate what you said, John, would you also say that if a law is found to be unjust or thought to be unjust according to the principles of natural justice or natural law, it should be rectified by legislative action, not by judicial action? Is that what you're trying to say?
Essentially, yes. The legislature should be the primary recourse. If it is subject to a more permanent type of law, such as constitutional law, but for our purposes, that's another form of positive law, then the recourse should be there. And I suppose the hardest question in this context comes when you consider whether the judge, confronted with a situation where he believes with good reason that the positive law will not be changed, is at liberty then to change it for himself or to accept the inadequacies of the positive law, even if it should lead to civil disobedience, as we talked about earlier, or, as Alan suggested, the ultimate civil disobedience, really uncivil disobedience, revolution.
Shirley?
I especially concur in the opinion expressed by my brother John up to a point.
You're a naturalist too?
Yes, it is impossible to me to put form, content, and substance on the grand concepts: equal protection of the laws, due process. These concepts must be understood, in my view, in a background of, in your terminology, natural law concepts, because we draw in the whole sweep of what is just and unjust.
Francis? And Betty Sue.
We cannot take these concepts in isolation. I think they have to be put in the context of an organized society which has its own values, its own objectives, and which constitute the yardstick by which we determine whether it is a moral principle or a legalistic principle. And even the third category you have of, technically wrong acts. In Scandinavia, they prohibited anyone to drive after having a drink. Initially, in many parts of the world, people drink and drive, and they think it's safe. In Scandinavia, initially, it was viewed probably as just a dictate of the law. But today, after years of this practice, it has become such a morality that even if you have just one drink, you are viewed by the Scandinavians as violating a moral principle of driving.
We're stating this issue in terms of Western jurisprudence. Perfectly obvious it's Western jurisprudence I'm referring to. But let me add to that, that the great defenders of the positivist position, Ulpian, the Roman jurist, was defending the absolute rule of the Caesars. And Thomas Hobbes, who's also a positivist, advocated absolute government, not limited government. There is a sense in which the positivist is the defender of the proposition, might makes right. Ulpian's great phrase was, whatever pleases the prince has the force of law. And the prince was an absolute ruler.
Yes. Make a point here, Mortimer, which impresses me. If I look over the history of Europe, which is a very troubled history, a very violent history, where societies have broken down and where authority has been destroyed, what always interests me is that you have periods when absolute power has been exercised without any question, and the ruler has asserted that he and he alone has the power to determine what is just and so on. The notion of law and the notion of justice as a natural thing, something which cannot be denied, always recurs.
It does.
And is always reborn. It's so interesting if you look at the discussions during the period of resistance to the Nazis during the war, when they were faced with a really monstrous tyranny. They all came back looking for this. They must somehow or other establish a system of law based upon principles, at any rate, which were independent of the will of the ruler.
Right.
Otherwise, there was nothing.
Why is this disagreement between the naturalist and the positivist so important to you?
I think it's a disagreement on an issue that most deeply affects not only our individual lives, but the lives of nations. The naturalist holds that there are principles of justice by which we can judge governments, constitutions, laws, the actions of a people as just or unjust, because these principles of justice are antecedent to the existence of states and governments and laws. The positivist says, no, there's no justice or injustice at all, except in a country where the laws that are made by men in power and enforced by men in power say what people should do or not do. Therefore, the justice would vary from time to time, place to place. What one government declares just is just in that country. What another government declares just is just in that country. There is no universal justice or injustice. If that's the case, we can't say that the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan is unjust. We can't say the violation of human rights in one country or another is unjust, because what that country declares to be just and unjust is just and unjust there. If we really believe in a universal code of human rights, we must take the naturalist position that there are principles of justice that prevail always and everywhere.
This is what Jefferson meant when he talked about the laws of nature and nature's God.
Precisely.
And without those, we are simply floating on the stream looking for an anchor.
Without those, we are subject to all the depredations of the doctrine that might makes right. And I can't think of any more grievously erroneous doctrine that might makes right.
May I ask you this? It's just, certainly in our hearts and in our minds, we must somehow determine what is just. I don't deny that. I am a member of a people who have some 400 treaties which urgently need adjudication in this country, which is telling other countries how to treat minorities and what is just and what is unjust, and who wish to terminate our lands and and abrogate our treaties so that our lands may be open to public exploitation. So I'm very sensitive to the notion of justice, especially since my people predate all other people in this land newly named America. But I am also concerned, therefore, with the manipulation of my people and other peoples in the world by a concept which calls itself natural justice.
Suppose I remove the phrase natural. I understand why the phrase natural law sticks in your throat. I could say the same thing by talking about universal principles of justice. Universal principles of justice that are antecedent in their truth to any man-made laws.
I don't mean to try to choose up sides on that, but simply to point out that if you accept the naturalist view that there is beyond the positive law some ultimate truth, some ultimate system of justice, you must also accept the risk that on this world, people will take it unto themselves to know what that is and will act accordingly. And that's why, Mortimer, if I may say so, when your book describes these ideas of liberty, equality, and justice as ideas we act on, it seems to me it puts an almost dangerous proposition. I would prefer to think of these ideas, particularly justice, just as you described the first three, ideas we judge by, ideas that govern our thoughts, our way of thinking about truth, goodness, beauty, and indeed liberty, equality, and justice. It may lead to action in a very evolutionary sense, but if it starts to lead to action in the most immediate sense, you run great risks, namely the risk of force.
I accept the amendment, and if I get Macmillan to change the jacket, I'll change the jacket.
Throughout the course of this republic, which do you think has had more influence on our history? The view of rights as natural, preceding whatever laws are passed by the state, or the positive view that what is justice is determined by the laws that the state passes?
I don't think there's any question that this country was founded on the theory of natural rights, the Declaration of Independence. is a statement of that. Jefferson, in that famous second paragraph of the Declaration, is saying that all men are endowed with certain natural, human, unalienable rights, and the justice of our government, he says in so many words, depends upon securing those rights, defending those rights, not transgressing those rights, so that the doctrine of natural rights is certainly fundamental to the framework of our government.
Yet consider how often, frequently, consistently, we have acted contrary to those principles. Back in Jefferson's day, in the treatment of slaves and women who were not considered to have these natural rights, as Jamaica Highwater said in the seminar, irrespective of the great ideals, his people, Native American Indians, blacks and women have all been treated contrary to the universal principles of human justice.
But let's think, absolutely true. In the course of this country's more than 200 years of development, we have slowly moved from less just laws, less just constitutional provisions, less just governmental policies to more just. Just think for a moment of passing from the disfranchisement of the whole female population to their enfranchisement. Their natural right to be treated as equal citizens with equal suffrage was violated for hundreds of years.
How do you account for the fact that we have been moving upward in a sense?
I'm an optimist in this respect. I think the human sense of fairness, of justice, of rights is so deep that men will always struggle, one way or another, to get more justice. I think the whole history of mankind in the last 2,000, 2,500, 3,000 years is a steady progress with some backsliding toward more and more just institutions. Alan?
I am a member of an organization known as Amnesty International, which does its best to bring to the attention of people and to publicize the facts about torture, cases of torture, illegal imprisonment, and so on. I think that is absolutely right to continue. I think that what has been done in the United Nations, hard uphill work in trying to reach agreement, bit by bit between a larger number of people about the sort of criteria and norms of behavior and the principles of justice, is marvelous and should continue. But I do not believe that you can slowly slip from that into anything comparable with a national system and a national system of law to enforce your justice simply by going on with those steps. Because the truth is, an international community barely exists. You have to talk in terms of power. And power is what is there to enforce the law. Without it, I don't think that your debates and so on will get very far. Now, I am not hopeless about that, because I think the basis upon which you do that is to try and show people by a political, not by a judicial or juridical process, show people by a political process that in the modern world there is a basic identity of interest between us, even between the Americans and the Russians, between all of us. For the first time, I think it is possible to show people. That's what I go after.
Do I dare ask you, Alan, in terms of that eloquent speech you just made, that in your heart you would favor world government? Do I dare ask that?
I don't know what it means, Mortimer. I'm sorry.
You do know what it means?
I don't know what it means. Bertrand Russell
it means something beyond the United Nations.
Once said to me in one of these debates which we had, that eminent philosopher, it would only come if one nation became top and dominated the rest and enforced
Toynbee
it.
said the two things.
It
can come in one of two ways, either by world conquest or by world federation.
Thomas Hobbes is the author of a famous saying, quote, "The war in society of each against all." What do you make of that in regard to justice?
Well, I have to say that I think you put that statement back into context. Thomas Hobbes is not describing man in a state of society, but man in a state of nature, in a state of anarchy. He's saying that the state of anarchy, which is the absence of government, puts individuals in a situation where there is a war of each individual against everybody else. And I say, in Hobbes' terms, the anarchy of sovereign states is the war of each against every other state. All states, all sovereign states, are in a state of cold or hot war.
So, isn't there a paradox there that it took government to begin the long process toward the recognition of and preservation of natural rights, but that as states became more sovereign, they themselves became violators of natural rights?
Well, because sovereign states are laws unto themselves. And one of the interesting things is that all great international lawyers, where there is no really enforceable international law, know that the use of international law is an appeal to the principles of justice. International law is nothing but a code of justice. May I thank you all for your extraordinary participation. I think that I've enjoyed this enormously in the last 6 days, and
Mortimer, I think we ought to say, and since I'm the oldest present, perhaps I might claim the privilege of saying how much, although we've disagreed with you so often, how much, although we must have driven you to exasperation as you drove us to exasperation, for sure.
Mutual exasperation.
You have never shown it. Your resilience and your readiness to continue the debate, even on terms you didn't accept, have won our admiration and affection.
We didn't come to agreement about the ideas. We did come to a sense of harmony with each other as individuals. And for me, using that as an analogy, if nations and individuals can come together and speak together...
By carrying on the conversation.
By carrying on the conversation, something
in
larger
fact,
emerges.
Betty Sue, my definition of peace is a situation in which the conversation can always be carried on.
So Mortimer Adler ends his Aspen Institute seminar on 6 great ideas. We've caught on film only a portion of the opinions exchanged, the excitements shared, the frustrations encountered, the disagreements expressed, the insights revealed. Our medium is limited when it comes to the life of a mind or tries to capture an encounter of intellect. There is always more than we can see beyond the shadows of the cave. The people who chance the medium with us must pass a sign that reads, "Beware the terrible simplifiers." Mortimer Adler is not afraid of such risks, and I've long admired him for the courage it takes to champion difficult thought in a popular form, where even the profound can appear superficial and the superficial profound. But his cause and that of his colleagues has been judged by them to be worth the risk of being misunderstood for wanting philosophy to be everybody's business. Says Mortimer Adler, "Everyone is called to one common human vocation, that of being a good citizen and a thoughtful human being." When you think about it, that's no small idea. I'm Bill Moyers.
For a transcript of this program, send $3 to Ideas, Post Office Box 900, New York, New York, 10101. This program was made possible by Atlantic Richfield Company, Energy, Chemicals, Minerals.